Hey, welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy tonight's stories. Here we venture into the dark web, peeling back layers of mystery and terror to reveal tales that were never meant to be told. Leave a like and subscribe for more dark web scary stories. I found a secret government file on the dark web. My name is listed as a test subject. All right, let me set the scene for you. I'm not some crazy hacker or anything like that. I'm just a regular guy who got way too curious for his own good. I'd heard all the stories about the dark web, hitmen for hire, red rooms and all that creepy stuff. I thought it was just urban legends people spread online to scare each other. You know, like Bloody Mary, but with more tech jargon. I didn't dive into the dark web looking for anything specific. Honestly, I was just bored. Work was slow, my social life was non-existent, and I figured, why not? So I downloaded a Tor browser, read a few how-to guides, and started exploring. Most of what I found was underwhelming. Sketchy forums, marketplaces selling counterfeit IDs, and the occasional conspiracy theory rabbit hole. Nothing that screamed danger. But then I found a link. It was buried deep in some thread about government surveillance. Just a random comment that read, "Check this out, not for the faint of heart." The link didn't have a description, no context, just a string of numbers and letters. I don't know why I clicked it. I should have ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. The page loaded slower than anything I'd ever seen. The background was plain black, and in the center of the screen there was a single line of text. "Welcome to Project Scion." Underneath it was a login screen, like it was meant for someone who already knew about this place. I was about to close the tab, but before I could, the screen flickered. The login boxes disappeared and new text appeared. Guest access granted. Proceed with caution. At this point, I was more intrigued than anything. I mean, how often do you stumble onto something like this? The site loaded into what looked like a file directory. There were folders labeled things like test subjects, experiments, results, and logs. It all looked so official, like something out of a movie where the protagonist stumbles onto government secrets they weren't supposed to see. I clicked on the test subjects folder. Inside there were dozens of files, each labeled with a string of numbers and letters. No names, no descriptions, just these cryptic file names. I scrolled down, aimlessly clicking on one. The file opened into a page of dense text. It was a report listing dates, medical stats, and something called outcome protocols. I skimmed it, but I didn't understand most of the jargon. It mentioned things like neurological recalibration and sensory modification. Whatever it was, it sounded wrong. Like someone had been experimenting on people, testing things they weren't supposed to. The kind of stuff that gives you goosebumps even when you don't know exactly what you're looking at. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. One file described a subject who'd reported hearing voices after their treatment. Another mentioned someone experiencing visual disturbances, seeing people who weren't there. But it wasn't until I clicked on the file labeled TS152 that my blood ran cold. The report started the same way as the others, a series of stats, experiment logs and dates. But this one was different. About halfway down the page, I saw a name. My name. At first, I thought it was some kind of coincidence. There are a lot of people with the same name, right? But then I saw my birth date. My exact birth date. And below that, my hometown, my high school. Even my parents' names were listed. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. How the hell was this possible? I'd never signed up for anything shady, never volunteered for any experiments. I was just a nobody with a desk job and a bad habit of scrolling Reddit at 3 a.m. But there it was, clear as day, my life laid out in black and white. The report described me in ways that felt invasive. It mentioned my medical history, things I hadn't even told my doctor. It listed behavioral observations that were eerily accurate, like how I tend to avoid confrontation and how I always sit with my back to a wall in restaurants. Stuff that wasn't just personal, it was private. But the worst part, there was a section labeled Phase 2 Activation. It had today's date. I closed the tab, my hands shaking. I shut down my laptop and unplugged it from the wall, like that was going to stop whoever had written that file from knowing I'd seen it. My apartment felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator felt amplified, like the whole world had shifted into some warped reality where I was the main character in a story I didn't want to be a part of. I told myself it was just some elaborate hoax, maybe a prank site designed to mess with people, but deep down I knew better. The details were too specific, too real. Someone, somewhere, had been keeping tabs on me, and they wanted me to know. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that file, my name glowing on the screen. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside my apartment, a faint scraping sound, like metal against metal. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a loose gutter or a stray cat. But then the sound moved, closer and closer, until it was right outside my window. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me to stay put, to keep my eyes fixed on the wall and pretend I hadn't heard anything, but curiosity won out like it always does. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and pulled back the curtain. The street below was empty, no cars, no people, just the dim glow of the streetlights. I was about to close the curtain when I noticed something on the glass. There were fingerprints smeared across the outside of the window. 5 long, greasy streaks, like someone had pressed their hand against it and dragged it down slowly. I stepped back, my pulse racing, and grabbed my phone. I don't know who I thought I was going to call. 911, my friends. I didn't even get the chance to decide because the second I turned the screen on, my phone buzzed. One new notification. It was an email, no subject line, no sender, just a single line of text. You shouldn't have looked. I dropped the phone, my blood ran cold, and in the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the hallway. I'll stop here for now. This is already longer than I meant it to be, but there's so much more to tell. I haven't even gotten to the part where I found out what Phase 2 activation means. I'll update soon. Just don't go looking for that file. Trust me, you don't want to end up where I am. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch with every light in the apartment on, staring at the front door, like it might burst open at any second. The greasy fingerprints on my window still burned in my mind, and every so often I'd glance at it, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. But nothing happened. The silence was worse than the noise. At least the noise would have made it feel real. By morning, I'd convinced myself that the email and the fingerprints were just a coincidence. Maybe someone had been messing with me and I'd let my imagination run wild. But even as I tried to rationalize it, a knot of unease settled deep in my gut. Something wasn't right. I decided to work from home that day. The thought of leaving my apartment made my skin crawl, like I was walking into a trap I couldn't see. Around lunchtime, I sat down with my laptop trying to focus on emails and spreadsheets, but my mind kept wandering back to that file. I knew I shouldn't open it again. I knew nothing good would come from it. But the curiosity was eating me alive. What did Phase 2 activation mean? Why was my name on that list? And most importantly, who had been watching me? Eventually I gave in. I booted up my laptop, plugged it back in, and opened the Tor browser. My heart raced as I navigated back to the page. I expected the link to be dead, or for the site to have disappeared, but it loaded just like before. the same black screen, the same folders. I clicked on the logs folder this time, thinking maybe it would explain more about the experiments or why my name was on that list. The files inside were all labeled with dates, going back years, decades even. I scrolled through them, trying to find something recent, and clicked on one from a week ago. It was a transcript, a conversation between two people, although there were no names, just A and B. A, subject, TS15. 2 has accessed the file. B, are we proceeding with activation? A, monitoring for now, no direct contact. B, and if they try to leave? A, they won't. My blood ran cold. They won't? What the hell did that mean? Were they watching me right now? I slammed my laptop shut and threw it onto the couch like it was burning me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. And then I heard it. A knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft, deliberate taps. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. No one ever knocked on my door. I live in a quiet apartment building where the neighbours mind their own business. My landlord never stops by unannounced, and my friends always call before visiting. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door, my hands shaking. The peephole felt like a lifeline and a threat all at once. I leaned forward slowly, my heart pounding in my ears, and looked through. No one was there. I backed away from the door, my chest tightening. My phone buzzed in my hand and I nearly dropped it. It was another email, the same blank subject line as before. I didn't want to open it, but my thumb moved on its own, like some part of me needed to know. We're closer than you think. I stared at the screen, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. My first thought was to call someone, anyone, but I didn't know what to say. Hi, I think some shadowy organization from the dark web is watching me. That's not exactly a call you make to the cops. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't focus, couldn't think. Every sound made me jump. A car backfiring outside felt like a gunshot. The creak of the floorboards sent me into a panic, even though I was the only one home. I kept checking the windows, expecting to see someone standing there, but all I saw was my own terrified reflection. By nightfall, I was a wreck. I locked every door, closed every curtain, and sat on my bed with my phone in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. It was pathetic, but I felt like it was the only way I'd get through the night. Around 2 a.m. I heard it again. The knocking. This time it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from inside the apartment. I froze, my grip tightening on the knife. The sound was faint, like someone was tapping their knuckles against the walls. It moved slowly, methodically, traveling from one side of the room to the other. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My phone buzzed again, and I looked down to see another email. Don't look behind you. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was stupidity. But I turned around. There was nothing there. Just the shadows of my room, stretching out longer than they should have, like they were reaching for me. And then the power went out. The apartment plunged into darkness, and I heard it, the tapping, louder now, more insistent. It wasn't just on the walls anymore. It was on the floor, the ceiling, everywhere, surrounding me. I stumbled out of the bedroom, gripping the knife so tightly, my knuckles ached. My phone was the only source of light, its dim glow barely illuminating the hallway. The tapping followed me, growing faster, more chaotic, like it was chasing me. I made it to the front door and fumbled with the locks, my hands trembling. But when I threw the door open, the hallway outside was pitch black. No emergency lights, no sound, nothing, just an endless void. And then, in the faint glow of my phone, I saw them. Figures. tall, motionless, standing at the end of the hallway, their faces obscured by shadows. They weren't moving, but somehow I knew they were coming for me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath hitching in my throat. The tapping stopped, replaced by silence so thick it felt alive. And then, as I stood there, shaking in the dark, my phone buzzed one last time. Phase 2 has begun. I didn't sleep after that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those figures in the hallway, tall, shadowy, and impossibly still. And that message, the one burned into my phone screen, Phase 2 has begun. What the hell was Phase 2? What did it mean for me? The email didn't explain anything, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. All I could think was that whoever, or whatever, was behind this wasn't just watching me. They were playing with me. By morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get out of my apartment, even if I didn't know where to go. I threw on a hoodie, grabbed my keys, and stepped outside. The fresh air hit me like a slap in the face, but it didn't calm the unease coiled tight in my chest. As I walked through the neighborhood, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those figures following me. But the streets were empty. Too empty. No cars, no people, just an eerie stillness that made me feel like I'd stepped into another world. I went to a diner a few blocks away, one of those places that's always open and always noisy. It was crowded enough to make me feel safe, at least for a little while. I ordered coffee I didn't even drink and pulled out my phone, trying to distract myself. That's when I saw it. My phone had a notification. Not an email this time, but a text. The number was unlisted, just a string of zeros. The message was short, only 3 words. Check your pockets. I froze. My hands immediately went to my hoodie pockets, and I felt something that hadn't been there before. My fingers brushed against paper, and I pulled it out slowly, my stomach twisting into knots. It was a folded-up note, written in neat, blocky handwriting. You can't run. You can't hide. We are always watching. I dropped the note like it had burned me. My mind raced. How had it gotten there? My hoodie had been hanging on the back of a chair all night. No one could have touched it without me noticing, unless they'd been in my apartment while I was sleeping. I left the diner without finishing my coffee, my nerves so frayed I felt like I was on the verge of snapping. The walk back to my apartment was a blur, every shadow and sound magnified 100 times. By the time I got home, I was practically shaking. But the worst part, when I walked through the door, something felt wrong. The air was heavy, thick, like the apartment itself was holding its breath. I set my keys down and froze. There, on my coffee table, was another note. Phase 2 is not about you. It's about what's coming. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. My first thought was to call someone, anyone, but who would believe me? The police. They'd laugh me out of the station. My friends. They'd think I'd lost it. So I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my laptop and went back to the dark web. I don't know what I was hoping to find. Answers, maybe. Or at least some kind of clue about what was happening. The site loaded just like before, but this time there was a new folder. Phase 2 logs. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the trackpad. Everything in me screamed not to open it, but curiosity has a way of overriding self-preservation. I clicked. The folder contained a single video file, no title, no description, just a timestamp from earlier that morning. My heart sank. I didn't want to watch it, but I knew I had to. The video started with static, the screen flickering in and out. Then the image sharpened, and I felt my stomach drop. It was footage of my apartment, my living room, to be exact. The angle was high, like it had been filmed from the ceiling. and I could see myself sitting on the couch, staring at my laptop. The video skipped ahead, and suddenly I wasn't alone. The figures from the hallway were there, standing just out of frame. One by one, they moved closer, their bodies unnaturally stiff, like marionettes on invisible strings. I watched in horror as one of them reached into my hoodie pocket and slipped the note inside. Then, as quickly as they'd appeared, they were gone. The video ended with a single frame, my own face staring blankly at the screen, completely unaware of what had just happened. I slammed the laptop shut and pushed it away, my pulse racing. They'd been in my apartment, not outside, not watching from a distance, inside. And I hadn't even noticed. A noise snapped me out of my thoughts. It was faint, coming from the hallway outside my apartment, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a lamp, and crept toward the door. The sound stopped. I peered through the peephole, expecting to see the hallway empty, like before. But this time, I wasn't so lucky. There was a figure standing just on the other side of the door. It wasn't moving, wasn't knocking, just standing there, waiting. I stepped back, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The doorknob rattled and I felt my knees go weak. I gripped the lamp tighter, ready to swing at anything that came through that door. But it never opened. The rattling stopped and the figure stepped away, its movements slow and deliberate. I heard its footsteps fade down the hallway, and then silence. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, but eventually I worked up the nerve to look outside. The hallway was empty. No sign of the figure, no sign of anything. But when I turned back to close the door, I saw it. Another note taped to the inside of the door. "You're part of this now. Prepare yourself." I ripped the note off the door and threw it across the room, anger and fear boiling together in my chest. I didn't want to be part of anything. I didn't want to prepare for whatever was coming. I just wanted it to stop. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to. I didn't leave the apartment the next day, or the day after that. Something about the note, "Prepare yourself," made me feel like stepping outside was the last thing I should do. It wasn't safety, though. Staying inside didn't feel safe either. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights made my heart race, but at least here, I could control my surroundings. Or so I thought. The first strange thing I noticed was the clock. It was one of those cheap wall clocks, the kind you don't think much about until it starts acting weird. I glanced at it mid-afternoon, and the hands were frozen. They hadn't moved in hours, even though the second hand twitched like it was trying. I thought, dead batteries. No big deal. But then, as I stared at it, the second hand jumped backward, just once. I shook my head, chalked it up to my imagination, and turned away. When I looked back, the clock was fine, ticking like normal. Little things like that started happening everywhere, a light bulb flickering even though it was brand new. The radio in my kitchen turning on by itself, static, hissing through the speakers, like something was trying to come through. My phone kept glitching too. Every time I unlocked it, the same phrase would flash across the screen for a split second before disappearing. "We are waiting." By the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my laptop and opened the site again, desperate for answers. The dark web was the only place where this all seemed to start, and I figured if it had started there, maybe it could end there too. The Phase 2 logs folder was gone. In its place, there was a new one. Patterns. I didn't want to click it. My instincts screamed at me not to, but curiosity won out like it always does. The folder contained a single text file. and when I opened it, the screen filled with data. Lines and lines of numbers, symbols, and timestamps. It didn't make any sense to me. There were random coordinates, dates, and what looked like snippets of text, but they were all jumbled together like someone had taken a bunch of information and thrown it into a blender. I was about to close it when one line caught my eye. It was buried in the middle of the chaos, but it stood out because it wasn't random at all. It was my address. Below that there was a timestamp, 11:58 p.m. I checked the clock. It was 11:30 p.m. My stomach dropped. My address wasn't just listed, it was marked like the timestamp was counting down to something. My pulse quickened as I tried to figure out what to do. Should I leave? Hide? Call someone? Every option felt useless. Whoever had put my name on that list had been a step ahead of me this entire time. They were playing a game, and I was just a pawn. At 11:50, I shut off every light in the apartment and locked myself in the bathroom. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all I could think of. The bathroom was the smallest, safest feeling place in the apartment. I sat in the corner with my back against the cold tile wall, clutching my phone in one hand and the kitchen knife in the other. The minutes ticked by slowly, each second stretching out like an eternity. My phone buzzed once at 11:55. It was another text, this time just a single word, ready. At 11:58, the lights in the apartment went out. Not just the lights, I mean everything. The hum of the fridge stopped. The faint whir of my laptop fan went silent. Even my phone, still clutched in my hand, powered down, leaving me in absolute darkness. And then the knocking started. It wasn't at the front door this time. It was coming from every wall, like there were a dozen people surrounding me, all tapping in perfect rhythm. The sound wasn't random, it was deliberate, methodical, like it was building up to something. I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the knife so tightly my fingers went numb. The knocking grew louder, more intense, until it felt like the walls were vibrating. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. It felt alive, like the darkness was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. It was faint at first, just a low hum, like static from a TV left on in another room. But it grew louder, sharper, until I realized it wasn't static at all. It was a voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it was coming from the hallway just outside the bathroom. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. The voice got closer, clearer, until I could hear it whispering just outside the door. It was my name. The doorknob rattled, once, twice, like someone was testing it. My grip tightened on the knife, every muscle in my body screaming to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door creaked open slowly, the darkness beyond it swallowing what little light was left. And then I saw it. A figure stepped into the doorway, its silhouette barely visible against the shadows. It was tall and angular, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My legs refused to move, my body frozen in place. The figure tilted its head further, as if it were studying me, and then, in a voice that wasn't quite human, it spoke. "It's almost time." And just like that, it was gone. The figure, the voice, the oppressive weight of the silence. It all vanished, leaving me alone in the dark. The lights flickered back on and my phone buzzed to life, displaying the same timestamp from the file, 11:58 p.m. But the clock on the wall said it was midnight. I wasn't sure if I had survived the night or if something far worse was waiting just around the corner. And deep down I knew Phase 2 was far from over. I didn't think I could be more afraid than I was that night, but fear has layers. It doesn't just peak and stop. It digs into you, planting roots, feeding off every unanswered question, every shadow that moves just slightly wrong. By the time the sun came up, I wasn't even sure what was real anymore. The next morning, everything seemed normal, too normal. The power was back on, the fridge was humming, and the clock on the wall ticked steadily. If it wasn't for the memory of that figure in the bathroom doorway, I might have convinced myself it was all a nightmare. But I knew better. I didn't leave my apartment that day. I barely even moved. I kept checking my phone, half expecting another text, another cryptic message. But there was nothing. No emails, no glitches, no whispers in the walls. Just silence. By nightfall, I was almost starting to believe it was over. But that's the thing about fear. It loves to play with hope. At 11 p.m., the first sign came. My laptop, which I hadn't touched all day, suddenly powered on by itself. The screen glowed in the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I didn't want to go near it, but the message on the screen pulled me in. Open the door. I stared at the words, my heart pounding in my chest. Open the door? What door? I glanced at the front door, half expecting to see something standing there, but it was closed, locked. Then I heard it, a faint creak from down the hall. The bathroom door. I grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter and moved toward the hallway, every step heavier than the last. The air felt thick again, like the walls were pressing in on me. When I reached the bathroom, the door was slightly ajar, just like it had been the night before. I pushed it open slowly, my pulse racing. The bathroom was empty, just like I'd left it. But something was off. The mirror over the sink was fogged, even though the room wasn't warm enough for condensation. I wiped it with my sleeve, and that's when I saw it. The writing, scrawled across the glass in uneven letters like someone had dragged their finger through the fog, were the words, "Turn around." I froze. My breath caught in my throat, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the knife. The urge to run was overwhelming, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at me not to, I turned. Nothing. The hallway was empty, just shadows stretching across the walls, flickering faintly as the light above me buzzed and dimmed. But then, just as I was about to step back, I saw it. A figure at the far end of the hallway, not tall and angular like before. This one was smaller, hunched over, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, waiting. I don't know what came over me, but I stepped toward it, the knife gripped tightly in my hand. Every step felt like I was walking deeper into a nightmare, but I couldn't stop. When I was just a few feet away, the figure tilted its head further, and I saw its face, or what was supposed to be its face. There were no features, just smooth, pale skin stretched tight over its skull, and then it spoke, its voice a low, guttural rasp that vibrated through the air. "You're ready?" Before I could react, the figure lunged, but it didn't attack me, it passed through me. I felt a cold, suffocating pressure in my chest, like my lungs were filling with ice water. My vision blurred, the room spinning around me as I collapsed to the floor. I don't know how long I lay there, gasping for air, but when I finally opened my eyes, the hallway was empty. Except for the door. The front door, the one I'd locked and bolted, was wide open. Beyond it wasn't the hallway of my apartment building, though. It was darkness, endless, impenetrable darkness that seemed to pulse like a living thing. My phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me out of my trance. I pulled it out with trembling hands, and there it was, another message. Step through. I didn't want to. I wanted to throw my phone across the room, slam the door shut, and pretend none of this was happening. But something about the darkness called to me. It wasn't a voice exactly. but more like a pull, a compulsion I couldn't resist. I took one step forward, then another, until I was standing at the threshold. The darkness seemed to stretch out in every direction, swallowing the faint glow of the apartment behind me. I turned back, but the hallway was gone. There was nothing left but the void. I don't remember stepping through, but I must have, because when I blinked, I was somewhere else. The air was cold, sharp, and the ground beneath me felt uneven, like I was standing on gravel. In the distance, I could see shapes, tall, angular figures moving slowly, methodically, like they were searching for something, or someone. My phone buzzed one last time, the screen lighting up with a final message. Welcome to Phase 3. I don't know where I am now. Time doesn't seem to work here. I haven't seen the sun, haven't slept. The figures are always moving in the distance, but they're getting closer every time I look. I don't know what happens when they reach me, but I can feel it. Something has changed. I'm not the same anymore. If you ever stumble onto something on the dark web that feels wrong, trust your instincts. Close the browser, turn off your computer. Don't go digging for answers like I did, because once you're part of this, there's no way out. I was paid $100 an hour to monitor unexplained events in a government building. Now, they're happening to me. It started with a job ad, one of those too good to be true listings that show up when you're desperate and out of options. I was between gigs at the time, scraping by with whatever I could find. So when I saw an ad offering $100 an hour for monitoring and reporting on-site activity at some government facility, I couldn't resist. The description was vague. Discrete individuals needed for confidential observational work. No prior experience required. Willingness to sign an NDA mandatory. That was it. No mention of what I'd actually be doing, just a hotline number and a promise of weekly payouts. My gut told me to ignore it, but my empty fridge and overdue rent said otherwise. I called the number, and a man with a crisp, no-nonsense voice answered. He didn't give me his name or much information, just asked if I could follow instructions and if I had any medical conditions that might interfere with long hours of stationary observation. When I said no, he gave me an address and told me to show up the next day at 8 p.m. The building was exactly as sketchy as I'd expected, a grey, windowless monstrosity on the edge of town, tucked away behind a chain-link fence and overgrown weeds. There was no sign, no logo, just a single metal door with a security camera pointed at it. When I arrived, a tall guy in a suit met me at the door. He looked like a CIA stereotype, complete with the earpiece and sunglasses, even though it was nighttime. "You're the observer?" he asked. I nodded, too nervous to say much. He handed me a clipboard with a stack of papers, a contract, an NDA, and a sheet of rules so specific it made my head spin. Do not leave your assigned post unless instructed. Do not interact with any anomalies. Do not, under any circumstances, speak to it. The last one sent a chill down my spine, but I convinced myself it was just corporate paranoia. Maybe this was some government testing facility or a place with classified tech. Weird, sure, but not illegal or dangerous, right? The guy led me inside to a small, windowless room with monitors covering one wall. There were 7 screens in total, each displaying a live feed of different parts of the building. Most of the cameras showed empty hallways or storage areas, but one was trained on a plain, unmarked door at the end of a long corridor. Something about that door immediately unsettled me. It looked wrong somehow, like it didn't belong there. "This is your station," the man said, motioning to the chair in front of the monitors. "Your job is to watch and document anything unusual. You'll have a notebook for notes. If you see something you don't understand, write it down. If it happens more than once, notify us through the intercom." "Who's us?" I asked. He ignored the question. "Your shift is 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. Someone will relieve you in the morning. Do not leave your post, no matter what you see or hear." With that, he left, locking the door behind him. The first few hours were uneventful. I watched the screens, scribbling random observations into the notebook just to pass the time. The unmarked door on camera 3 drew my attention more than the others. It didn't move, didn't change, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with it. The lighting in that hallway seemed off, like the shadows were a little too dark, a little too long. Around midnight, things got weird. It started with a flicker on camera 5, the one showing a storage room filled with metal shelves. The lights in the room dimmed for a second, then came back on. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen. At first I thought it was just a glitch, but then I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a tall figure standing at the back of the room. It wasn't moving, it just stood there, partially obscured by one of the shelves. I couldn't make out any details, just a vague silhouette. I grabbed the intercom and pressed the button, my heart racing. Hey, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's someone in the storage room, camera 5. No one answered. "Hello?" I tried again. Still nothing. The silence made my skin crawl. I glanced back at the monitor, and the figure was gone. By 2 a.m. I was on edge. The screens flickered occasionally, and I started hearing faint noises, static hisses, distant bangs, and once, what sounded like faint laughter. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, that the isolation and late hour were messing with my head. But then camera 3, the one pointed at the unmarked door, went black. I tapped the monitor, hoping it was just a technical glitch, but the feed didn't come back. A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed the intercom again, my voice trembling this time. "Camera 3 is out. Should I check it?" For the first time, there was a response. A man's voice crackled through the speaker. "Stay at your post. Do not approach the door." The line went dead before I could ask anything else. The rest of the night was a blur of flickering screens and muffled noises. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. By the time my shift ended, I was a nervous wreck. When the guy in the suit showed up to relieve me, I practically ran out of the building. He didn't say a word, just gave me a curt nod before locking the door behind me. I spent the entire next day convincing myself I'd imagined everything. It was just a boring government job with some faulty equipment and creepy vibes, that's all. Nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something. And when I showed up for my next shift, that feeling only got worse. When I showed up for my second shift, the guy in the suit was waiting for me again. This time, he didn't even bother with small talk. He handed me the clipboard with my updated instructions, same rules as before, plus one new addition that sent a shiver down my spine. If camera 3 goes offline again, do not investigate. Stay at your post and wait for further instructions. I wanted to ask why, but the guy's expression made it clear he wasn't going to answer. He just motioned toward the monitor room, and I reluctantly stepped inside. The room felt different that night. It was the same as before, 7 monitors, a notebook, and that eerie silence. But something about the air was heavier. It felt charged, like the static build-up before a thunderstorm. I settled into my chair, my eyes immediately drawn to camera 3. The unmarked door was back on the screen, looking just as off-putting as before. It wasn't just the door itself. It was the way the shadows around it seemed to ripple, like they were alive. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the other cameras. Most of them showed empty hallways and storage rooms, nothing out of the ordinary. For the first few hours, everything was quiet. Too quiet. I found myself glancing at the intercom every few minutes, half expecting another cryptic message. By midnight, My nerves were shot. That's when the first noise came. It wasn't loud, just a faint tapping sound, like knuckles rapping against wood. At first, I thought it was coming from the hallway outside the monitor room, but then I realized it was coming from the speakers on the monitors, specifically from camera 3. The tapping was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the unmarked door. It hadn't moved, but the shadows around it seemed darker now, deeper. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible hum. I wrote it all down in the notebook, my hand shaking slightly. "Tapping noise from camera 3, I scribbled. Shadows around the door appear to be moving. At 1 a.m., things escalated. Camera 5, the one showing the storage room, started flickering again. This time, it wasn't just a glitch. The lights in the room were dimming and brightening in an erratic pattern, and for a split second, I thought I saw the same figure from the night before. It was closer now, standing in the middle of the room, staring directly at the camera. I grabbed the intercom. "There's movement on camera 5, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. "Hello?" I tried again, but the intercom crackled and went dead. I stared at the figure on the screen, my stomach churning. It didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, watching. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. By 2 a.m., I was convinced I wasn't alone in the building. I started hearing faint whispers, like someone was having a conversation just out of earshot. The sounds weren't coming from the monitors or the hallway, they were coming from everywhere. I checked the notebook to see if the last guy on shift had written anything similar, but it was blank. Either he hadn't noticed, or he'd been too scared to document it. That's when camera 3 went offline again. The screen blinked to black, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stared at it, half expecting the intercom to crackle to life with instructions, but it didn't. The silence was unbearable. Every instinct screamed at me to get up, to check the hallway and make sure the unmarked door was still closed. But I remembered the new rule: do not investigate. Instead, I sat there, frozen, my eyes darting between the other monitors. For a while, nothing happened. The whispers stopped, the flickering lights steadied, and I started convincing myself it was just another equipment failure. But then I heard it. The tapping. Louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the speakers anymore. It was coming from the wall behind me. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. The sound stopped as soon as I turned, leaving only the low hum of the monitors. I sat there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding, waiting for something, anything, to happen. At 3 a.m., the intercom finally crackled to life. "Do not leave the room," the voice said. It wasn't the man from earlier. This voice was deeper, colder, and somehow distorted, like it was being filtered through layers of static. "You're being watched." My blood ran cold. I grabbed the intercom, my hands shaking. "Who's watching me? What's happening?" No response. The line went dead again. I looked back at the monitors, scanning each one frantically. The hallways were still empty, the storage rooms still silent. But when my eyes landed on camera 3, I froze. The feed was back, but the door wasn't empty anymore. There was something standing in front of it. At first, I thought it was the same figure I'd seen on camera 5, but this was different. It was taller, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its head was tilted slightly as if it were listening. And then, slowly, it turned to face the camera. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was smooth and featureless like a mannequin. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank slate of pale skin. But somehow I knew it was looking at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as it raised one long, bony hand and pointed directly at the screen. At me. I don't remember much after that. One moment, I was staring at the monitor, and the next, I was outside the building, gasping for air. My shift was over, and the guy in the suit was standing next to me, his expression unreadable. "You need to decide if you're coming back," he said, handing me an envelope. Inside was my first payment, $1,200 in crisp bills. "But if you do, you'd better be ready for what's next." I didn't respond. I just got in my car and drove home, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure on camera 3. The way it had pointed at me like it knew exactly who I was. Like it was coming for me. I told myself I wouldn't go back. I even wrote out a resignation email, but I never sent it. The envelope of cash on my kitchen counter was a constant reminder of how much I needed the money. Rent was due in a week, and my savings were non-existent. So, against every ounce of better judgment I had left, I showed up for my third shift. The guy in the suit wasn't there this time. Instead, the door was already unlocked, and the clipboard with my instructions was waiting on the desk in the monitor room. The rules were the same, but now there was another addition scribbled at the bottom. "If the figure points at you again, do not acknowledge it." My stomach churned as I read it. How did they know? Did they see it on the playback? Or was this some kind of sick setup? Either way, I didn't have a choice anymore. I sat down at my station, my eyes immediately drawn to camera 3. The unmarked door was back, and the hallway surrounding it looked more distorted than ever. The shadows weren't just darker. They seemed to pulse, stretching and contracting like they were alive. I shivered and forced myself to look at the other monitors. The first few hours passed in relative silence. No flickering lights, no tapping, no whispers. For a brief moment I let myself believe that maybe things would be different this time. But then, around midnight, the temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath as I exhaled, the sudden chill cutting through my jacket. The monitors flickered, and for a split second, all 7 screens showed the same thing. The unmarked door, the shadows writhing around it like smoke. When the feed stabilized, everything looked normal again, except for camera 3. The figure was back. It wasn't standing in front of the door this time. It was crouched, its long, spindly limbs splayed out like a spider. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and although its face was still blank, I could feel its focus on me. I froze, my hand hovering over the intercom. But what was I supposed to say? That the faceless thing from last night was back, crawling toward the camera, like it was trying to get closer to me. My fingers hovered for a moment longer before I pulled them back. I couldn't bring myself to call for help, not after what happened last time. The next few hours were pure agony. The figure didn't move, it just stayed there, crouched in front of the unmarked door, its head twitching slightly, like it was listening for something. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the other monitors, but my eyes kept drifting back to camera 3. At 3 a.m. the whispers started again. They were louder this time, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a rhythm to them, a cadence that felt deliberate. They didn't sound like they were coming from the monitors or the hallway. They sounded like they were coming from inside the room. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the corners of the room, but there was nothing there. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening cacophony. I covered my ears, my heart pounding, and then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I turned back to the monitors, and my blood ran cold. The figure was gone. I scanned the other cameras, my hands shaking, but there was no sign of it. I grabbed the intercom, my voice cracking as I called for backup. "The figure is gone from camera 3. I don't know where it went." There was no response. "Hello." I tried again, panic creeping into my voice. "Is anyone there?" The intercom crackled, and that same distorted voice from before came through. "Do not move. Do not look away from the monitors." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to obey. My eyes darted back to the screens, scanning each one for any sign of movement. The hallways were empty. The storage rooms were empty. Even the unmarked door looked still. And then I saw it. The figure was on camera too now, in the hallway directly outside the monitor room. It was standing perfectly still, its featureless face turned toward the door. I couldn't breathe. My fingers hovered over the intercom, but I didn't know what to say. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on my chest. I stared at the screen, willing it to disappear, but it didn't. The intercom crackled again. "Do not acknowledge it." My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. I glanced at the door, half expecting it to burst open, but nothing happened. I forced myself to look back at the monitors, my eyes darting between the cameras. The figure was closer now. It had moved without me noticing, its spindly limbs stretched out as it crawled toward the monitor room door. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched it inch closer and closer. Its head tilted to the side again, like it was listening, and then, slowly, it raised one long, bony hand and pointed at the camera. At me. I panicked. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that door as possible, but the intercom's warning echoed in my head. "Do not acknowledge it." I forced myself to stay still, my breathing shallow as I stared at the screen. The figure didn't move. It just stayed there, pointing, its blank face almost mocking me. The air in the room grew colder, the shadows in the corners seeming to stretch and twist toward me. The figure's arm dropped suddenly and it crawled out of frame. I blinked, my stomach churning, as I realized it was no longer on camera. I frantically scanned the other monitors, but it was gone. That's when the door handle rattled. I jumped out of my chair, my flashlight clattering to the floor. The sound was faint but deliberate, like someone testing the lock. My eyes darted back to the monitors, but they were all blank now, the feeds replaced with static. The handle rattled again, harder this time, and I backed into the corner of the room, clutching the flashlight like it was a weapon. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct, and I swore I could hear my own name among them. And then everything stopped. The whispers, the rattling, the cold. It all vanished in an instant, leaving me in suffocating silence. When the guy in the suit showed up to relieve me, I was still in the corner, trembling. He didn't say anything, just helped me to my feet and handed me another envelope. "You survived," he said simply, his tone almost impressed. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I wasn't coming back, or at least that's what I told myself. I didn't sleep after that third shift. I didn't eat either. I just sat in my apartment staring at the envelope of cash on my coffee table like it was cursed. I kept replaying the night in my head, trying to make sense of what had happened. The figure, the whispers, the way it moved closer without actually moving. It didn't feel real, but it was. The proof was in the fresh bruises on my arms from gripping the edge of the desk too hard, the raw ache in my throat from holding back screams, and the clawing dread that followed me everywhere, even in broad daylight. I wanted to believe it was over, that I could walk away from that building and never look back. But deep down, I knew the job wasn't done with me. The first sign came that evening. I was sitting on my couch, half dozing, when my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, no caller ID. My stomach twisted as I stared at the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hello?" Silence. Then after a long pause, a voice crackled through the line. It wasn't distorted this time, but it was cold and emotionless, like someone reading from a script. "You haven't completed your obligation." I froze. I quit. I'm not coming back." "You agreed to observe?" the voice continued, ignoring me. "You agreed to follow the rules. You've broken the rules." "What rules?" I snapped, my voice shaking. "I didn't do anything wrong." The line went dead, leaving me in a silence so thick it felt alive. I threw the phone onto the couch like it was burning my hand. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight. I tried to convince myself it was just the company trying to scare me into coming back, but the pit in my stomach said otherwise. That night, the dreams started. I was back in the monitor room, but the screens were blank. The only sound was the faint tapping from camera 3, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was inside my head. I turned to look at the door, and there it was, the figure standing just outside, its bony hand pressed flat against the glass. I woke up, gasping, my sheets damp with sweat. My bedroom was dark, but something felt off. The air was too still, too quiet. I reached for my phone to check the time, but when I unlocked the screen, my heart stopped. The camera feed from camera 3 was playing on my phone. The unmarked door was slightly ajar, and the shadows around it writhed like they were alive. My hands shook as I fumbled to close the app, but no matter what I did, the feed stayed on the screen. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The phone went black, leaving me staring at my reflection in the blank screen. By the next morning, I was a mess. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, following me. Every shadow felt too long, every creak in the floor too deliberate. I was jumping at every noise, flinching at every flicker of light. I told myself I needed to leave, to get as far from that building as possible. Maybe a change of scenery would help, give me some distance. I packed a bag and drove to a motel an hour out of town. The room was small and dingy, but it felt safer than my apartment. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe until the tapping started. It was faint at first, coming from the wall behind the bed. I sat up, my heart racing, trying to convince myself it was just the pipes or the wind. But the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't random, it was the same rhythmic tapping I'd heard on the monitors. My hands shook as I pressed my ear to the wall, and that's when I heard it. A whisper, so soft I almost missed it. "Why did you leave?" I stumbled back, grabbing my keys and bolting from the room. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring as I sped down the highway. My hands were slick with sweat, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know where I was going, anywhere but there. The next few days blurred together. I bounced between motels, barely sleeping, barely eating. But no matter where I went, the tapping followed. It came from the walls, the floors, the ceilings. Sometimes I'd hear the whispers too, always the same question, always in that same cold, emotionless tone. "Why did you leave?" By the fourth night, I was desperate. I didn't know what else to do, so I called the number from the job listing. It went straight to voicemail, but the recording was chillingly familiar. "You agreed to observe. You agreed to follow the rules." I hung up, my hands trembling. I couldn't go back to that building. I couldn't face the figure again. But it was clear now that I didn't have a choice. Whatever I'd left behind wasn't going to let me go. I arrived at the building just before midnight. The door was unlocked just like before, and the monitor room was exactly as I'd left it. The screens flickered to life as I sat down, my stomach churning with dread. Camera 3 was online, but the unmarked door was open now. The hallway beyond was pitch black, the shadows deeper than anything I'd ever seen. I leaned forward, my breath catching as a figure stepped into the frame. It wasn't the same as before. This one was smaller, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. It took a few hesitant steps, then stopped, turning to face the camera. Its face wasn't blank this time. It was mine. The figure on the screen, the one with my face, stared directly into the camera. Its features weren't quite right, though. The eyes were sunken, the skin stretched too tightly over the bones. It tilted its head, mirroring my own movements as if it knew I was watching. My stomach churned, but I couldn't look away. Then it smiled. Not a normal smile. This was something predatory, unnatural. Its lips curled back too far, revealing teeth that were jagged and wrong. I grabbed the intercom, desperate for an explanation, for anything. "Why is it me?" I stammered. The intercom crackled to life, but instead of the cold, scripted voice I was expecting, there was laughter. Soft at first, but it grew louder, more distorted, until it filled the room. I slammed the intercom off, my heart hammering in my chest. When I looked back at the monitor, the figure was gone. The unmarked door was still open, though. The hallway beyond it seemed to stretch endlessly, its walls lined with shadows that writhed and pulsed like living things. I couldn't tell if the distortion was the camera feed or the hallway itself, but either way, it made my head spin. Then the tapping started again. It was louder now, more insistent. It didn't come from the walls or the monitors. It was coming from the unmarked door. Each knock sent vibrations through the room, rattling the desk and making my teeth ache. I stared at the screen, frozen, as a second figure stepped into view. It wasn't just my face this time, it was me. Same clothes, same posture, same expression of wide-eyed terror. It stared into the camera for what felt like an eternity before it did something that made my blood run cold. It pointed, not at the screen this time, not at the door. It pointed at me. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair, as the lights in the room flickered and went out. The monitors stayed on, their glow casting eerie shadows across the walls. I could feel something watching me, feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on my shoulders. My breathing was ragged, my chest tight, but I forced myself to stand. The rules echoed in my head. Do not leave your post. Do not acknowledge it. But the rules didn't seem to matter anymore. Whatever I'd been hired to observe wasn't staying behind the monitors. It was here, with me. The tapping turned into pounding, and I realized it wasn't coming from the monitors anymore. It was coming from the hallway outside the monitor room. The sound grew louder, more frantic, until it felt like the door would splinter under the force. Then silence. I held my breath, waiting for the next sound. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I pointed it at the door. Nothing happened. For a moment I thought it was over. And then the door handle turned. I didn't wait to see what was on the other side. I bolted for the back corner of the room, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls. The door creaked open and I could hear footsteps now, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. I forced myself to look up. The monitors were still on, but the feeds had changed. All 7 screens now showed the same hallway, the one outside the monitor room, and there, standing in the doorway, was the figure with my face. It wasn't smiling anymore. Its head tilted slowly to one side as it stepped into the room, its movements jerky and wrong. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to melt into the shadows, but its gaze found me anyway. "You left," it said, its voice a distorted echo of my own. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The figure took another step forward, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it closed the distance between us. "You broke the rules," it said, its tone sharp and accusing. "I didn't mean to," I choked out. "I didn't know—" "You knew," it interrupted. Its head snapped to the side, its gaze locking onto the monitors. "You always knew." The screens flickered, and for a brief moment I saw flashes of images, faces I didn't recognize, twisted in terror, hallways that stretched endlessly, shadows that seemed to consume the light. And then the unmarked door, wide open, with countless figures spilling out of it, their blank faces turning toward the camera. The figure in front of me crouched down, its face inches from mine. Its breath was cold, and I could feel its presence pressing against me like a physical weight. "You can't leave," it whispered. "You belong to it now." Before I could react, its hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. The touch burned like ice, and my vision blurred as the room seemed to tilt and shift around me. The monitors went dark, the tapping returned, and the figure's distorted smile was the last thing I saw before everything went black. I woke up outside the building. The sun was rising, casting a dull orange glow over the empty parking lot. My head throbbed, my body ached, and my mind was a jumbled mess of half-formed memories. I stumbled to my car, the keys already in the ignition, and drove home in a daze. When I got there, the envelope of cash was waiting on my kitchen counter, just like before. But this time there was something else with it. A folded piece of paper with a single sentence written in sharp, precise handwriting. "You're still observing?" That was 2 weeks ago. The tapping hasn't stopped. It follows me everywhere now, my apartment, my car, even when I'm outside. The whispers come at night, soft and insistent, and I've started seeing shadows in places they shouldn't be. I don't know what's real anymore. The job, the figure, the unmarked door, it's all blurred together into a nightmare I can't escape. And the worst part? Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, my reflection doesn't move. It just watches, and it's smiling. I found a live stream on the dark web that shows human experiments in real time. The next subject was my neighbor. Let me start by saying this. I'm not a hacker, programmer, or some kind of tech genius. I'm just a regular guy who spends way too much time on the internet. I've always been curious about the darker corners of the web, the kind of places you hear about but know you shouldn't explore. For years, I'd convinced myself that most of the horror stories about the dark web were just that, stories. Fake. Made up to scare people like me. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. A few weeks ago, I stumbled across a random thread on an old forum I hadn't visited in years. The post was titled, "Real Dark Web Streams, 100% Legit." Normally, I'd scroll past that kind of thing, but something about it caught my eye. The replies weren't full of trolls or people calling it fake. Instead, they were vague and weirdly enthusiastic, like everyone was in on some twisted secret. One comment stood out. It just said, "Follow the link, but don't say I didn't warn you." Below it was a string of characters that didn't look like a normal URL. Now I know what you're thinking. Red flags everywhere, right? But I wasn't planning to actually watch anything. I figured it would be some prank, or maybe just a boring live stream of someone sitting in a dark room pretending to be creepy. I wasn't scared, I was curious, so I copied the link, fired up Tor, and pasted it into the search bar. The page that loaded was simple, black background, red text, no logos or flashy graphics. At the top, it just said, "Live experiments. Viewer discretion advised." There was a countdown timer below it, ticking down from 5 minutes. A chat box sat on the side of the screen. filled with users posting things like, "Can't wait for this one," and "Hope it's better than last night." My stomach twisted a little, but I stayed. I told myself it was fake, that it was probably just an ARG or some edgy performance art. Besides, the timer was already down to 2 minutes. What harm could it do to watch for a few seconds? When the countdown hit 0, the screen changed. A video feed appeared, grainy but clear enough to make out the details. The camera was pointed at a small, dimly lit room, concrete walls, a metal table, and a single chair bolted to the floor. It looked like a basement, or maybe some kind of underground lab. At first, the room was empty. Then the door opened, and 2 figures walked in wearing black masks and gloves. They were dragging someone with them, a man blindfolded and gagged, his hands tied behind his back. He was struggling, but they overpowered him easily, forcing him into the chair and strapping him down. The chat exploded. "Here we go!" "New subject. This one looks weak, LOL." My hands were sweating. I hovered over the browser's close button, telling myself to leave, but I didn't. I just couldn't. Something about it felt too real, and I needed to know what was going to happen next. The 2 masked figures left the room, and the man started thrashing in the chair, screaming through the gag. His muffled cries echoed in the small room. Then a voice came through the speakers, a deep, robotic tone that sent chills down my spine. "Experiment 47 begins now. Subject will be tested for pain tolerance under electrical stimulation. Viewer feedback encouraged." My heart dropped. Pain tolerance? Electrical stimulation? This had to be fake. There was no way it could be real. But then the man screamed again, louder this time, as sparks erupted from a device attached to his arm. His body convulsed, his muscles straining against the straps. It wasn't over the top like in movies. It was raw and horrifying. The chat lit up with reactions. "Turn it up." "Weakling can't even handle level 1. Next experiment better be good." I couldn't move. My brain was telling me to shut it off, but my eyes stayed glued to the screen. The man's screams grew quieter, his body slumping in the chair. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The camera zoomed in on the man's face. His blindfold had slipped slightly, revealing part of his features. I recognized him. It was my neighbor. I slammed my laptop shut so hard the table rattled, but it was too late. I'd seen enough. My neighbor, Mr. Holden, was the one strapped to that chair, screaming like his life depended on it. Mr. Holden wasn't just some random guy in my building. He was the friendly older man who lived a few doors down, the kind of neighbor who'd hold the elevator for you or ask how your day was when you ran into him. He wasn't the type of person you'd expect to see on some twisted dark web live stream. I sat there in my dark apartment, staring at the closed laptop, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might explode. My rational mind tried to tell me it wasn't him, that it couldn't be him. It had to be someone who looked similar, or maybe it was just some elaborate deep fake. But deep down, I knew better. The face, the greying hair. It was Mr. Holden. I stood up, pacing my tiny living room. What the hell was I supposed to do? Call the police? What would I even tell them? "Hi, I was watching a sketchy live stream on the dark web, and I think my neighbor's being tortured." Yeah, that wouldn't go over well. The thing that scared me the most, though, was the timing. I'd seen Mr. Holden just that morning. He'd been carrying groceries, smiling like usual. How had he gone from the cheerful man in my hallway to that? How fast had they taken him? And more importantly, how had he ended up there in the first place? I needed answers. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone, I opened my laptop again. The stream was still running. Mr. Holden was slumped in the chair now, his head hanging forward, his breathing shallow. The chat was still active, full of users typing things like, "Weak subject, bring on the next one," and that was boring. Who's next? Then a message popped up that made my stomach twist. New subject to be revealed in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. That's all it would take before they dragged someone else into that room. I couldn't just sit there and watch, but I also couldn't look away. I felt like I owed it to Mr. Holden to figure out what the hell was going on. I opened a new browser tab and started searching for anything that might explain what I was seeing. I typed things like dark web human experiments livestream and real torture streams online, but most of what I found were urban legends and fake articles, nothing concrete. Then I remembered the forum. Maybe the people in the thread knew more. I went back to the post and scrolled through the replies, looking for anything useful. Most of them were cryptic and unhelpful, people bragging about how exclusive the stream was or how hard it was to find. But one comment caught my attention. It was from someone named Observer47, and it simply said, "If you're watching, you're already part of it." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. Part of it? What did that mean? Before I could think too hard, my laptop dinged, a notification. I clicked back to the stream and my blood went cold. The camera had shifted, and now the screen was showing a list of names. The chat was going crazy, with users typing things like, "Place your bets," and "Pick number 3, they look scared already." My heart stopped when I saw the list. My name was on it. It was at the very bottom, typed in the same red font as the rest. My full name, clear as day, followed by my apartment number. I slammed the laptop shut again, my hands shaking. This wasn't some random live stream anymore. Whoever was running it knew exactly who I was. They'd pulled my name from... what? My IP address? My personal information? How had they connected me to Mr. Holden? I backed away from the desk, feeling like the walls of my apartment were closing in. I checked the locks on my door and windows, making sure everything was secure. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. If they'd gotten to Mr. Holden, they could get to me. Then I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold, knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my front door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't the kind of knock you'd expect from a neighbor or delivery person. It was heavy, calculated, almost taunting. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door. "Who is it?" I called, my voice trembling. No response, just silence. I checked the peephole, but the hallway was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching me. The knocking came again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I backed away from the door, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but what would I even say? And before I could decide, my phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. I opened it, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. The message was short, just 4 words. "You're next. Be ready." I don't know how long I stood there staring at that message. 4 simple words that felt like a death sentence. "You're next. Be ready." My brain was scrambling for an explanation, but there wasn't one. Whoever, or whatever, had sent that text knew where I lived. They knew my name, and they wanted me to know I was a target. The knocking stopped after the message. That should have been a relief, but somehow it was worse. The silence pressed in around me, making every creak of the building and gust of wind sound like something, or someone, lurking just out of sight. I backed away from the door, clutching my phone. My first instinct was to call the police, but I didn't know what to say. Would they even take me seriously? "Hi, I was watching a dark web live stream and now I think someone's trying to kidnap me." Yeah, right. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I texted Ethan, one of my closest friends, and the kind of guy who never judged me, no matter how stupid my choices were. Me. Are you awake? Ethan. Yeah, what's up? Me. I think I'm in trouble. Can you come over? Ethan. Trouble how? What's going on? Me. Just get here. I'll explain. Ethan didn't reply right away, but I knew he'd come. He lived a couple of blocks away and he wasn't the type to blow off a message like that. I just had to hold out until he got here. To calm myself, I started checking every lock and window in the apartment again. Everything seemed secure, but it didn't make me feel any better. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then my phone buzzed again. For a split second, I thought it might be Ethan, but it wasn't. It was another message from the same unknown number. Watching won't save you. My stomach dropped. I didn't know what they meant until I looked at my laptop. The screen was on, even though I was sure I'd closed it. The live stream was still playing. The camera had shifted again. This time, it wasn't showing the experiment room. It was showing my hallway. My breath caught in my throat. The angle was low, like the camera was placed on the floor just outside my apartment. I could see my door, my welcome mat, even the faint outline of the peephole. The chat was active, the same twisted users making comments like, "Nice setup. How long until he freaks out? Hope they don't make it easy on him." I slammed the laptop shut, but it didn't matter. They weren't just watching my hallway, they were here. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Ethan. Ethan, almost there. What's going on? Me. Someone's outside my apartment. I'm not kidding. I sent the message and ran to the kitchen, grabbing the biggest knife I could find. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it, but I gripped it tighter and forced myself to stay calm. The knocking came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not on the front door this time, on my bedroom window. My apartment is on the 3rd floor. I froze, staring at the window, unable to move. The blinds were down, but I could see the faint outline of a shadow. It didn't make sense. No one could be out there, not without a ladder or something, but the shadow moved, shifting slightly as if it knew I was watching. Then my phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "Open the door, or we'll come in another way." My breath was coming in short gasps now. My head was spinning. I didn't know what to do. If I opened the door, I'd be walking straight into whatever trap they'd set. But if I didn't... The shadow outside the window started to grow. It wasn't possible, but it was happening. The edges stretched, creeping down the walls like smoke, spreading across the floor. The air in the room grew heavy, cold, making it hard to breathe. I clutched the knife tighter, backing into the corner. The shadow stopped growing, hovering just a few feet away from me. And then it spoke. Not out loud, but in my head. A deep, distorted voice that sounded like it came from everywhere at once. "You watched. Now it's your turn." Before I could scream, my front door burst open. I spun around, expecting to see the masked figures from the stream, but it was Ethan, his eyes wide with panic. "What the hell is going on?" he yelled, slamming the door behind him. I didn't answer. I just pointed at the window, but when Ethan turned to look, the shadow was gone. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice rising. "There's nothing there." I didn't know what to say. The shadow, the voice, it was real. I knew it was. But now, with Ethan here, it was like it had vanished, leaving no trace behind. Then my laptop dinged. Ethan and I both turned to look. The screen had turned on again, the live stream still playing. The chat was going wild and the camera had changed angles again. This time, it wasn't showing my hallway or the experiment room, it was showing me. The sight of myself on the live stream made my stomach lurch. The camera was showing me in real time, standing in my own apartment, holding the knife with Ethan beside me. The grainy feed captured everything, my wide-eyed panic, the tension in my shoulders, even the faint flicker of the lamp in the corner of the room. Ethan froze, staring at the screen. "Is that us?" I nodded, unable to speak. The chat was exploding, lines of text flooding in faster than I could read. Words like, "Look at him, he's terrified," and "What's he going to do with the knife?" stood out, mocking me. Someone even typed, "Bet he doesn't make it out alive." "Who's doing this?" Ethan demanded, his voice shaky. "How are they watching us?" I didn't have an answer. My head was spinning, my chest tightening as I tried to piece together what was happening. The camera feed shifted slightly, zooming in on my face like it was taunting me. It wasn't just showing me, it was focused on me. Another message popped up in the chat. 10 minutes until the experiment begins. "What experiment?" Ethan asked, his voice rising. "What the hell does that mean?" Before I could respond, my phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. This one was different, longer, more specific. "You've been chosen. Comply and it will be quick. Resist and he suffers too." I showed the message to Ethan, my hand trembling. He read it, his face going pale. "Who's he? What are they talking about?" My blood ran cold as a horrible realization hit me. "It's you," I whispered. "They're talking about you." Ethan blinked, taking a step back. "Number, no way, this is insane. Why would they come after me? I didn't even do anything." Neither of us had time to process it. The lights flickered and the room grew colder. That oppressive silence filled the air again, heavy and suffocating. My phone buzzed once more, and I hesitated before looking at it. The text was just one word: "Now." Suddenly the sound of static filled the room. It was coming from my laptop. The live stream had changed again, showing a new angle. This time, it wasn't inside my apartment, it was outside. The camera was focused on the building, pointed directly at my window. The chat erupted with excitement. "They're almost there." "This is going to be good." "Bet he runs." My breath hitched. "Ethan, we need to leave. Now." But before we could move, there was a sound I'll never forget. A low, metallic scrape, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It came from the hallway outside my apartment. Ethan and I froze, staring at the door. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped right outside. Then came the knocking. 3 deliberate knocks, slow and steady. Ethan grabbed my arm. "We can't stay here. We need to go." I nodded, my heart pounding, but my legs felt like lead. The knocking came again, harder this time, rattling the door on its hinges, and then a voice, low, guttural, distorted like it was coming through a broken speaker. "Let us in." Ethan didn't wait. He yanked me toward the window, his voice trembling. "Fire escape! We'll climb down, let's go!" I followed him, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the window. We pushed it open, the cold night air hitting us like a slap. Ethan climbed out first, gripping the rusted metal railing of the fire escape. I was halfway through the window when the door burst open. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just scrambled onto the fire escape, my breath coming in short gasps. Ethan was already climbing down, and I followed as fast as I could. Below us, the alley was dark and empty, but it felt safer than staying inside. We were halfway down when I heard it again, that low, scraping sound. But this time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from above us. I glanced up and immediately wished I hadn't. Something was climbing down the fire escape. It wasn't human, that much was obvious. Its limbs were too long, its movements too unnatural, jerking and twitching like a broken marionette. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes, bright, glowing pinpricks of light, were locked on me. "Go!" I shouted, shoving Ethan downward. "Go faster!" We practically fell the last few rungs, landing hard in the alley. Ethan grabbed my arm, dragging me toward the street. I didn't look back, but I could hear it. Metal creaking, the thing moving closer, faster than it should have been able to. We ran until my lungs burned, finally ducking into a 24-hour diner a few blocks away. The fluorescent lights felt harsh after the darkness of the alley, but I didn't care. It felt safe. For now. Ethan and I collapsed into a booth, gasping for air. The waitress gave us a weird look but didn't say anything, probably assuming we were just a couple of drunk idiots. "What the hell was that?" Ethan hissed, his hand still shaking. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not over." I pulled out my phone, dreading what I might see. Sure enough, there was another text waiting for me. "You can run, but you can't hide. The experiment begins soon." And then, just as I was about to put the phone down, one final message appeared. "Check the live stream." I didn't want to. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, to throw my phone into the nearest trash can and never look back. But I had to know. I opened the stream. The camera was back in my apartment, panning slowly around the room. It paused on something that made my blood run cold. It was Ethan's wallet lying on the floor, and next to it, scrawled in what looked like blood, was a single word. "Ready." Ethan stared at me as I held my phone, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "What's on the screen?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to admit what I'd seen. But the look on his face told me he already knew it wasn't good. "Your wallet," I whispered. "It's in the apartment. And..." I hesitated, trying to find the words. "They wrote something. It says ready." Ethan shot out of his seat, running his hands through his hair. "What does that even mean? How is this happening? They can't... This isn't possible." "It's not just possible," I said, my voice trembling. "It's happening. They're inside, Ethan. They've been inside the whole time." Before he could respond, the screen on my phone glitched. The stream started buffering for a moment before cutting to a new angle. My heart dropped as I realized what I was seeing. The camera was no longer in my apartment. It was here, inside the diner. The feed showed the booth we were sitting in, the angle slightly off, like the camera was placed low, maybe on the floor. The chat exploded. "They ran, but they're cornered now." "Game time? Don't let them leave." I slammed the phone onto the table, my hands shaking uncontrollably. "They're watching us, right now." Ethan leaned over, his eyes darting around the diner. There were only a handful of other people, 2 truck drivers at the counter, the bored waitress leaning against the coffee machine, and an older couple in the far corner. None of them seemed out of place, but that didn't mean anything. "Where's the camera?" Ethan whispered, scanning the room. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It could be anywhere." Then the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, just a faint dimming, but it was enough to send the panic coursing through me again. The other patrons didn't seem to notice. They just kept sipping their coffee, chatting quietly, like nothing was wrong. But we knew. "We need to go," Ethan said, grabbing my arm. "Now!" We didn't even bother paying. We bolted out of the diner and onto the street, the cold night air hitting us like a slap. I checked over my shoulder, half expecting to see the thing from the fire escape, but the street was empty, too empty. "What now?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking. I didn't have a plan. Running wasn't working. They always seemed to know where we were. Calling the police wasn't an option either. All I knew was that we couldn't stop moving. "Let's get somewhere crowded," I said. "A place they can't just walk into without being noticed." Ethan nodded, and we started running again. We didn't talk. Every shadow felt like it was stretching toward us. Every noise made us flinch. The city, usually so alive at night, felt eerily quiet. When we finally reached the plaza in the center of town, my lungs were burning. It was a relief to see other people, groups of friends, couples walking their dogs, a busker playing guitar near the fountain. For the first time all night, I felt like maybe we were safe. But then my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. My hands were shaking so badly that Ethan had to take the phone from me. His face twisted in horror as he read the message. "Crowds don't matter. Look behind you." We turned slowly, our hearts pounding. The plaza was still bustling, nothing out of place. But then I saw it, something standing at the edge of the fountain, partially hidden in the shadows. It was the same figure from the fire escape. Its limbs were too long, its movements unnaturally slow and deliberate. It stood there, staring at us with those glowing pinprick eyes, as if daring us to run. "What do we do?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know. My mind was blank, paralyzed by fear. All I could think was that this was it. We'd run out of options. Then it started walking toward us. The crowd didn't notice. People kept laughing, chatting, walking past it like it wasn't even there. The thing moved closer, its shadow stretching across the plaza like it was alive. And then, without warning, it stopped. Its head tilted to the side and it raised one hand, pointing directly at me. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was strapped to a chair in a room that looked all too familiar. The concrete walls, the metal table, the dim, flickering light. It was the same room from the live stream. I tried to move, but the straps held me in place. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Across from me, another chair sat empty. The camera mounted on the wall was pointed directly at me, its red light blinking. A voice crackled through hidden speakers, deep and robotic. "Experiment 48. Subject, my name. Viewer participation encouraged." The chat box appeared on a monitor beside me, the messages flooding in. "Finally, the main event." "Make it hurt. I've been waiting for this all night." "No," I whispered, struggling against the restraints. "Please, no." The door opened, and two figures in black masks entered, dragging someone behind them. My blood turned to ice when I saw who it was. It was Ethan. He was unconscious, his head lolling to the side as they strapped him into the chair across from me. When they were done, they stepped back, leaving us alone in the room. The voice returned, cold and detached. "Begin." The camera zoomed in on me, and the monitor displayed a new message. "Choose him or you."